All right, welcome everyone to our second Wetlands, and Watershed Seminar of Fall 2020. We are live streaming to YouTube, so if you're out there in the world, hopefully you can hear us. And we're recording, of course, this seminar for the in-class students in both environmental engineering and soil and water sciences. Today we have the honor of hearing from John Kominoski, who is an associate professor in the Institute of Environment and Department of Biological Sciences at Florida International University. John is an ecosystem ecologist whose research focuses on how disturbances alter biogeochemical cycling and organic matter processing in terrestrial, freshwater, and coastal ecosystems. So John works in a variety of ecosystems, but he's also the co-PI of the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program, or the LTER. And today, John's going to talk to us about discrete and continuous disturbances in coastal ecosystems. So John, with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for the invitation. I'm sharing my screen now, so you should be able to see my slides.
Perfect, we can see everything great.
Thank you. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm very honored to be talking to y'all. Just as some background, I did my PhD at the University of Georgia, the Odom School of Ecology. And so it's an honor to be able to talk to y'all at the HT Odom Center for Wetlands. And a lot of the research that I do is fundamentally, inspired by the Odoms, Tom Odom, Eugene Odom, and Bill Odom. And Bill Odom did his dissertation work in the Everglades and has really formed the basis of a lot of the research that we're beginning to test in the LTER, in the Florida Coastal Everglades LTER, in terms of understanding the pulsed dynamics of coastal systems and how those pulses are changing. So I'm really honored to talk to you today about some of the work that I'm doing or have done and continue to do along the Gulf Coast in Texas, as well as in Florida, mostly in the Everglades. So a lot of the research that I'm focusing on now has to do with disturbance ecology. My background is fundamentally in linking ecosystems, terrestrial and aquatic. So I was trained as a stream ecologist and worked in forested systems. And turns out when you get below Lake Okeechobee, there's not a whole lot of streams. So we have canals and we have glades and we have wetlands. And so I've transformed the study systems into more coastal systems, which are highly disturbed. So in 1985, Pickett and White are sort of foundational at quoting what disturbance is. And of course, disturbance is one of these concepts in ecology that are long debated. Are disturbances bad or good? Well, they're neither, they just are. And so Pickett, to this day, argues, and rightfully so, that disturbance is any relatively discrete event in time that disrupts ecosystem, community, or population structure and changes resources, substrate availability, or the physical environment. So disturbance is kind of a lot of stuff. It drives a lot of the systems that we study and the systems that we depend upon. Deb Peters and others, and really I think it was the first issue of the journal Ecosphere, built a little bit more on the concept of disturbance and talked about legacies. So these discrete events might be events, but they have lasting impacts sometimes, and sometimes more lasting than others. And so there are biological and non-biological legacies that interact with other drivers that are occurring, as well as successional processes that influence the response of systems to change. So in 2017, Nancy Grimm and others developed the idea that disturbance really is this process. So you have an event that is this tall rectangle that has different drivers, different disturbance types, different mechanisms, and the system that becomes disturbed has certain properties. Those interface to change disturbance. The disturbance changes the system properties in such a way that it affects the disturbance impact. So you can kind of think of this simply like systems that are more resilient versus systems that are more resistant. So that disturbance impact then can be subsequently exposed to further disturbances. So the system changes, it gets exposed to more disturbances or different disturbances, and those impacts are different over time. So disturbance really is this dynamic process. And they applied this concept to urban systems to build in a social ecological component. And then more recently, Evelyn Geiser and several of us pulled this concept of disturbance through the long-term ecological research network and applied the model to different biomes, different ecosystems, and different biomes that have different levels of human environmental feedbacks. Those feedbacks can change the vulnerability of people and systems to disturbances, as well as the changing environmental drivers. And that can influence the sensitivity that systems and people living in systems have to disturbances. And for those of you that are interested in this concept in a more tangible, applied way to the entire continent of North America, I recommend reading up on Abram Lustgarten's recent issue on climate migration. It's pretty harrowing. So we developed this idea, inspired really by Odum 1969 strategy of ecosystem development, that changes in ecosystem development can occur due to changes in what we're calling the press pulse regime. So systems have presses and pulses. Those presses and pulses can be increasing, as outlined in or illustrated in yellow. They can be stationary, just white, black and white, or they can be non-stationary, transforming in ways that are different from their historic patterns. And so depending upon where you are along a development trajectory from young to mature systems, where you're storing more carbon as you get GPP above ecosystem respiration and higher net ecosystem productivity, and more retention in older systems relative to young systems, depending on where you are in your trajectory can influence your subsequent trajectory. So whether or not the system maintains at a pulsed stability, whether it continues to develop and store more carbon and build more elevation if you're a coastal system, or whether it starts to decline over time, or whether it starts to decline rapidly. So I'm going to talk about different types of disturbances, from hurricanes to restoring freshwater pulses and presses in long altered, hydrologically altered Everglades systems, to drought and fire. So kind of spanning the gamut of different types of disturbances that are either discrete events, pulses, or presses. Also sea level rise being a big disturbance facing coastal systems worldwide. And basically asking the question, how are these disturbances interacting with each other and other long-term changes to influence ecosystem trajectories? So this question really forms the basis of our renewal proposal for the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program, which is focusing primarily on hydrologic pulses, but asks how pulse dynamics, hydrologic pulse dynamics in coastal systems are being changed, and how those changes are affecting the vegetation state of coastal systems. So you've seen this graphic before that I showed earlier about the trajectory of development, and an example of fresh and marine water pulses from high to low on the Y, and stressors that are associated with changes in the relative fresh and marine water delivery in coastal systems. Saltwater intrusion, a big stress. So is it low to high? And depending upon where you are in your pulse regime in terms of fresh and marine water and your stress level, low to high, for saltwater intrusion, you may transition from a vegetated state to an open water state. And what are the feedbacks that can enable us to delay or reverse state change in these systems? So the last figure at the bottom shows example trajectories forecasting vegetation, state changes, and water level for the Southern Everglades, and looking at peat accumulation as a function of elevation and as a function of changing water level. And we really need to begin to forecast how changes in the productivity of our dominant vegetation in response to salinity, the main stressor with saltwater intrusion, are influencing the ability of peats to accumulate, stay the same, or collapse as sea level rises. Big questions. So I'm going to focus first on hurricanes. And okay, so 2020 is shaping up to be way more intense than 2017, perhaps, although 2017 goes definitely on the records for the number of large category hurricanes. And so we've got Hurricane Harvey that influenced Texas, Hurricane Irma that influenced the Caribbean and influenced Florida, and then Hurricane Maria that influenced the Caribbean. I'm going to focus on Harvey. So we have work that we've set up, long-term ecological research plots in Port Aransas, Texas, in an area of more saline, hypersaline, succulent marsh that has been transformed to a dominant mangrove species, black mangroves, Abyssinia germinans. So Abyssinia germinans has come into this part of the Gulf Coast and is continuing to expand poleward. And it's been for about 4 decades, it's believed. So in 2012, because Texas, you can get a permit to remove mangroves, which is sort of heretical, but we did. We built a gradient of mangrove cover from all mangroves removed to subsequently more mangroves intact, all the way up to 100% mangrove cover of black mangroves. And then we measured basic processes of surface and subsurface organic matter and sedimentation rates. And then along came Hurricane Harvey after we had built that baseline of data. So this is an example of the cover gradient, all mangroves removed, 100% mangroves right next to it, and then this variation in percent mangrove cover in these large plots that have different 3x3 meter patches of marsh or mangrove. Harvey comes and allows us to test what happens when you have a gradient in mangrove cover in this large scale disturbance event. Well, a lot of things changed, but the few things that I want to focus on are primarily associated with C and F. So soil, delta S34, so the relative sulfate sulfide. So if you're at a stable isotope of S34, if you're above 0, you're sulfate producing. If you're below 0, you're sulfide producing. And sulfide is toxic at high concentrations for plants. So we saw pre-Harvey high sulfate in sediments or in soils and surface sediments, and then a rapid depletion of that. So high sulfide production. And that persisted more than a year after the event as well. We saw a rapid decrease in surface and soil percent phosphorus. So right here is the accretion of phosphorus in the surface sediments, and it went down by about 10%, or 10 times rather. So here's the soil beneath the accreted surface layers, and you can see phosphorus was variable, super low. It's a very nutrient limited wetland, but it dropped dramatically across all levels of mangrove cover in both marsh and mangrove patches, and remained low a year after Harvey. Again, soil sulfide, much like the accreted sediment sulfide, started to increase after Harvey. So pre-Harvey, everything was above 0. And after Harvey, we started seeing that the marsh mangroves, especially in our fringe, which is located here by this figure on the right, the fringe mangroves in gray, or fringe mangroves or fringe marshes actually even started to become more sulfitic. And that change in both marshes and mangroves occurred a year later. So there was this ensuing legacy of Hurricane Harvey that was affecting marshes and mangroves, especially on our fringe along the coast. So this is a figure that shows an outline of our plots, our little patches, and then the rack line or the sediment debris line from Harvey, as well as a bunch of debris, including people's roofs and telephone poles and car parts. I mean, it was really traumatic, really, for the marsh. But in a large extent of the marsh was actually protected because it was actually underwater. These are pretty short mangroves, or just a little above a meter at their highest height. So one of the things that we wanted to do was test differences in organic matter that was recalcitrant or labile. So mangrove litter is more recalcitrant than marsh litter, and we wanted to test this using standard substrates as well as native substrates. And so we found that labile litter broke down higher in marshes than in mangrove soil surfaces. And this is true for both breakdown rates per day as well as per degree day, accounting for the differences in microclimate between marsh and mangrove. Interestingly, we had pre and post Harvey black mangrove litter, and this black line represents the pre-Harvey median breakdown rates. We had nearly double the breakdown rates of mangrove litter after Harvey compared to pre-Harvey. We also saw that marsh litter did clearly break down faster than mangrove litter, both in terms of breakdown rate per day as well as per degree day, and that interior breakdown rates were higher than fringe. So this fringe really was disturbed, and that's where the sulfide concentrations were the highest. And we saw that that influenced breakdown rates. But interestingly, there was some sort of subsidy that was influencing breakdown rates post-Harvey that was accelerating it compared to pre-Harvey, mostly in our interior. So now I'm going to look at changes in two different disturbance types. So looking at where we have hurricanes as well as saltwater intrusion. And I'm just going to showcase two case studies from the Everglades. So the first is following Hurricane Irma, again, 2017. And depending on where you are in a coastal mangrove, just like what I showed earlier with respect to Texas, if you were on the fringe versus interior, the effect of the hurricane was very different. Well, also, if you are near coast or upstream along a riverine continuum, along our tidal creeks, we've got mangroves that are lining our tidal creeks, moving far inland in the Everglades. And if you're closer to the source of sediment, that can be actually a subsidy. And so here we show that Harvey or Irma came in and had over a meter worth of storm surge, and that pulsed a lot of phosphorus from the Gulf of Mexico into the interior of the coast. And you got that phosphorus pulse if you were closer to the coast and if you were closer to the river than if you were further upstream and further inland or further away from the channel. And so those pulses are actually really important for producing elevation by stimulating root growth, and our forests regenerate really quickly. Not in every location, but certainly in our riverine mangroves. In contrast, we know that saltwater is slowly intruding with sea level rise. And so we have these beautiful peat soils that accumulate and help to increase elevation, as illustrated to the left under this pictograph that says natural. You can see the limestone and the thick peat soil and the trajectory of development of that peat over thousands of years can rapidly degrade the right-hand side, which decreases elevation. And we have shown this to be true even in experiments where we've added phosphorus and slightly elevated seawater. The presence of seawater can transform the soil elevation, decreasing it by about 2.6 centimeters within about 160 days of exposure at 10 parts per thousand. And that's what this bottom figure is showing. So what happens when we look at changes in saltwater intrusion and changes in freshwater delivery and effects of droughts? Well, throughout the Everglades, these are our two main drainages, Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough. Shark River Slough is much more productive. Taylor Slough is much less productive. We're actually seeing in our marsh that's being restored with fresh water that the biomass of our dominant species, Cladium hymecenses, is actually declining. One of our sites, Shark River Slough 2, as well as all three of our sites represented here as region. So Shark River Slough is representative of what's happening in our larger region, where biomass is going down as we're putting more fresh water into the Southern Everglades. We're creating more slough where we've maybe had more ridge. And this is an example of the pulsing year to year and seasonal variability in water level, but you can see that it's actually trending slightly up over time. The same is true with sawgrass density. Here we've got, if we just took a snapshot of time, illustrating the importance of long-term research. So from 2014 to 2018, it looked like density was pretty stable. And then you can see where that's in the time series here. But relative to the 20-year period of record, densities of sawgrass have also been going down. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about restoration, which technically is a disturbance, a good disturbance if you want to look at it that way. It's changing what this picture here in the upper right is showing Tamiami Trail, which bisects South Florida and creates the Southern Everglades to the south and Central Everglades to the north. And it's being bridged, which is part of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. And through that restoration plan, we're redistributing fresh water in the Southern Everglades beneath these bridges. And here's our distribution of plots in this large landscape of what we call Northeast Shark River Slough. And we've been able to capture seasonal differences and over time, year-to-year differences in the duration of water on the surface of the wetland, the hydro period, and looking at how that changes the distribution of phosphorus from the source of phosphorus in the system at the upper end, both the long-term effects of the canal that has cut off fresh water as well as dumped water into these pulse points artificially and created loading of phosphorus over 100 years. And now we're starting to freshen the Southern Everglades. So what's happening to that? Well, it really occurred around 2015, the onset of the modified water deliveries. And then again, after, Hurricane Irma, we really started seeing a lot more water entering into the system. And that's illustrated here by what happened to the water level in the L29 canal that's alongside Tamiami Trail. So you can see at the onset, of what's called modified water deliveries, incremental tests. It was actually a lot lower median water level than Hurricane Irma in subsequent years, where the water level really increased in the canal and subsequently increased hydro period in the landscape beneath. So the darker blue is longer hydro period compared to lighter blue. So at a large spatial scale, we've seen increases in that hydro period due to the restoration. And what we're seeing, a lot of things are changing, a lot of things are also not changing, but one of the more striking things is summarized in this figure here, and I'll just summarize it more simply with the words next to it, that increasing hydro period is changing the slope, or at least it's occurring with a change in the slope of distance decay in subsurface soil total phosphorus concentrations, which are illustrated here on the right-hand column, total phosphorus, and then the carbon to phosphorus and nitrogen to phosphorus ratios. They're becoming less different upstream to downstream than whence they were. So there is a transformation occurring in the soil, and we need to continue to monitor where that phosphorus ends up, because a lot of that loaded phosphorus is legacy phosphorus from past disturbance. Now I'm going to move into fire and the effects that fire has with interacting hydro periods. So the Everglades has systems that are definitely different in hydro period. We have more long hydro period wetlands, intermediate hydro period wetlands, and short hydro period wetlands in our marl prairies. And the Everglades National Park has a long history of fire management. From 1948, it was actually the first national park to have a fire management plan. And fire is very common in the Everglades. And interestingly, though, if we look at this figure that shows wildfire surface area of burn relative to prescribed fire surface area of burn, we're seeing nonlinear declines in wildfires and exponential increases in prescribed fires. And our ability to manage fire is also helping us to understand how we can manage phosphorus through fire. And I won't show much of those data today, but just to illustrate a few broad concepts from more than 500 soil samples that have been collected from different studies funded by Everglades National Park. So along this hydro period gradient from long to intermediate to short, we see that shorter hydro period wetlands have less soil carbon and less soil nitrogen than longer hydro period wetlands. And hydro period has less of an effect on soil phosphorus than carbon and nitrogen. However, years since fire is definitely influencing the soil phosphorus storage in wetlands across hydro periods. So here we've got this time since fire gradient from 0 to 1, so recent fires, 2 to 15 years, 16 to 39 years, and 50 to 56 years. And it seems that the peak soil phosphorus storage occurs in wetlands that have been burned in the last 2 to 15 years. So once that phosphorus, when wetlands burn, when vegetation burns, it volatilizes carbon and nitrogen to the atmosphere, and it precipitates inorganic phosphorus. And so where does that phosphorus go? And based on some analyses from the marl prairie environment, it looks like most of it's actually going back up into cladium. Looking at these response ratios in years post-fire, there's a rapid resorption in cladium relative to periphyton, which is abundant in the marl prairie, and we weren't sure if it was serving as a conduit for phosphorus retention. But it appears it's mostly going to cladium. So now I'm getting towards the end of the talk, and I want to just wrap up some broader phenomena of disturbance and disturbance interactions that we've been looking at in the Everglades. and show you some long-term patterns from our water chemistry data. So 2005, Hurricane Wilma hits. That's a major disturbance event. 2008 was the Mustang Corner Fire, which burned a lot of Northeast Shark River Slough. In 2010 and again in 2011, we had some prolonged cold snaps in South Florida that killed a lot of tropical plants and animals. And then in 2011, we had a drought, or I guess it was 2010. And we've had a couple more drought and flood events, most recently in 2015. I guess most recently would have been this 2020. We had a drought in spring. 2015, we had a drought followed by an El Nino flood. And then we have Hurricane Irma in 2017. So we have a lot of interacting disturbances in the timeline of our LTER program to study the interacting effects of. And I mentioned to you that water levels are increasing overall because we're restoring the Everglades, especially in the upper marshes. Freshwater levels are getting higher and hydro periods are getting longer. And sea level is creeping up and actually has jumped up in the last decade from an average of 3 millimeters per year, some places up 16 millimeters per year. Our freshwater marsh water levels are more variable and more driven by climate and management, but our marine levels are increasing steadily with sea level rise. So how does that look biogeochemically in the landscape? We've got Shark River Slough on the top 4 and Taylor Slough on the bottom. And again, Shark has a lot more water and is much more productive than Taylor Slough. Shark is more peat dominated, Taylor is more marl dominated. And we can see that for dissolved organic carbon, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and bacterial productivities, that different disturbances drive different patterns of increase for those different elements. So for dissolved organic carbon, we know that that's coming mostly from our peats, and it's really changing with respect to drought and flood events associated with hurricane, especially Hurricane Irma in 2017. Fire actually increases total nitrogen through enhanced nitrogen fixation. And we also see that certain events associated with droughts and floods enhance total nitrogen in both Shark River Slough and in Taylor Slough. Phosphorus increases predominantly during hurricanes. So those hurricanes are fertilizers to our wetlands, even though they do come with some destruction. And interestingly, bacterial productivities have increased and remained elevated for almost a decade following our freeze events, which probably liberated a lot of organic matter and enhanced water column productivities of bacteria. Overall, what we're seeing is that these legacies of disturbance are increasing, as well as synchronizing over space, spatial temporal synchrony of nutrients and bacterial productivities in these coastal wetlands, from the coast mangroves to the inland freshwater marshes. I'll just end by saying that we are really trying to capture how fresh and marine pulses are interacting and changing ecosystem trajectories. And we're really well poised to do that in the FCE because we have this great network of eddy flux towers that are in both short and long hydroperiod freshwater marsh, as well as in our riverine, high productivity, tall mangrove forests, scrub forests in Taylor, and now in our seagrass meadows, where we can begin to capture the landscape scale carbon sink strength and try to capture more of that carbon in our higher productivity mangroves and try to keep from losing more of it in our marsh and seagrass meadows. So that's the focus of our future in the FCE, and a lot of the research that I'm doing is trying to understand where these vegetated coastal systems are going whether they're staying vegetated, whether their composition is changing, or whether they're becoming open water, and what that means for the elevation of the coastal systems in South Florida. I just wanted to end by, these are my lab group from the last couple of years on the top two figures. The FCE is a huge group of 150 plus collaborators from 35 institutions. And the heart of our LTER is really our students. And then I wanted to give a thanks to some really strong interagency collaborations. We are so fortunate to work not only with the National Park, but with the South Florida Water Management District and the Everglades Foundation, among other institutions and agencies in South Florida that enable this kind of work to not only be conducted, but then to be implemented into management associated with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. And I would thank these agency funding sources and collaborators as well. And I'd love to take questions.
Great, thanks so much, John. I appreciate the scope of disturbances and responses that you were able to share with us in such a short time. I'm going to try to, if you could stop your share. Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and we have some questions coming in from the YouTube stream already. So we have Dr. Elliot White from University of Virginia. He asks, will mangroves see a net increase or decrease in area given the pluses and minuses of climate change? Oh, that's an easy question. I started with something really easy. What do you think, given sea level rise, given differences in nutrients and warming towards poleward expansion?
That is thanks, Elliot, and also maybe thank you for, you probably got me the invitation to this seminar, Elliot. So if that's the case, I appreciate it. I think that we're seeing, on a global scale, we are seeing certainly net losses in mangroves, largely due to aquaculture. And the challenge is that we can't, aquaculture and agriculture, right? So palm oil plantations. We need to understand how to increase accretion rates in mangroves in order for them to be able to continue to persist. And so that varies a lot, and it varies a lot depending on the geomorphology of the coastline, as well as, we think, the species of mangroves. So in short, I think what we're going to see is a lot of winners and losers, but I do think that we are probably seeing more losers in terms of mangrove adaptations to climate and land use.
So yeah, the disturbances you talked about today, really ran the gamut, but were primarily natural. They might be exacerbated by things like climate change and water management, but they weren't sort of the direct aquaculture conversion or land use, development. So
correct. And so just to reiterate that, I mean, I think we are trying to understand what causes mangrove mortality, and we don't yet fully understand that. Sedimentation can bury pneumatophores of black mangroves, but sedimentation doesn't seem to affect white and red mangroves the same way. It actually seems to stimulate them. So it depends too on the composition of your mangrove forests.
Yeah. We have a question from Kathy Ewell. Go ahead, Kathy.
Can you tell me if there have been any changes in distribution of the various species or growth rates with these other changes going on?
That's a great question. So within the Everglades specifically, we're trying to map using satellite images, and from the WorldView 2 satellite, we are looking at not only the representativeness of our long-term sites in terms of composition, but also how that composition at the landscape scale has changed. And it has changed. where it's changed the most is in the white zone, which is to the southeast. And most of our studies focus towards the south and southwest Everglades. But the white zone, just by around the Homestead area, has expanded dramatically in the last 70 to 40 years. And it's becoming more barren. And it's believed that that area is just not able to recruit sawgrass because of the higher salinities and not as much flushing. So for that area, it's changing dramatically. And perhaps I didn't really show this at all, but the reason why we were trying to capture these open water states with peat collapse, what's been called peat collapse, but elevation loss, is because we're getting more and more of those pockets, these lagoons that are forming and expanding in the landscape. And that's occurring in more in our peat-dominated systems of shark in the ecotone. So our ecotone is dramatically changing. And to some extent, the fringe areas of the Everglades are changing, both with restoration, because we're getting more open water from like behind me, with restoring hydrology, as well as how we use fire to remove exotic species. So Daniel Gann and Jenny Richards are collaborators that have been working on these kinds of questions for a long time, but we're really trying to scale up, and Daniel is doing that.
Thanks,
Thank
John.
you.
Okay, yeah, we have a question from Julio Pachon. Can you elaborate more on the bacterial phosphorus increases after the freezes? Why does this occur? Why are the impacts seen for such a long time? And does it tell us anything about the microbial population or community in the system?
Great question, Julio. Julio was my first REU when I arrived at FIU 8 years ago. So it's awesome to see him in science actively. So those are really good questions. We probably, anytime you have decomposition, which occurs mostly in areas that get dry, you see a spike in phosphorus. It could be that the mortality that occurred, which occurred during times of the year when the water levels were actually the highest, it could be that that freeze event caused an increase in liberated phosphorus that eventually, or not really eventually, but has continued to elevate the bacterial productivities in the system. I don't know if it's phosphorus or if it's carbon and phosphorus, but those are questions that we just don't really know mechanistically, and we need to figure out. However, in terms of the microbial population and the microbial communities, you might be surprised to learn that we know very little about the microbial communities in the Everglades. However, through partners with UF, Ulrich Stingel and Wilm Martins Habena at IFAS in Davie, we are exploring the benthic and water column microbial communities. And what I can tell you from the microbial communities from Uli's work is that they don't change much year to year. So they're really spatially constrained. And so a lot of that is, of course, driven by phosphorus and salinity, but how much of it is driven by variability in labile forms of carbon and phosphorus remains to be seen. So we just don't know.
In some ways, that's a good place to be, I suppose, if you're still trying to ask good questions. We have a question from Thomas Tyner in class. Go ahead, you can unmute.
Hi, I just had a question about how mangrove restoration will account for impeding salinities and how thermal expansion and the increasing sea level might factor into that. And then I also had a question about the structure seen behind you that bisects the southern Everglades from the central. I just wanted to know the timeline of that structure. Like, how long do you think it should be in place for restoration purposes?
Cool questions. Okay, so sea level rise, thermal expansion and mangrove restoration and the adaptations of mangroves, those are really, those are big challenges. I think I'll say that we know that sea level is rising rapidly in South Florida, largely due to changes in the Gulf Stream and the changes in the way that water flows in Florida Bay. And it's actually started to slow. And so we get more ponding of water. And so the waters are already pretty warm, but warming them further would cause that water level to increase. What we do know is that historically, where we have had lots of peats, so looking more at Biscayne coastal wetlands as an example, using sediment cores, going down, thousands of years, that those peats, areas that had lots of peat, that peat got exhausted. And so it's expected that areas, if the mangroves cannot keep pace with sea level, which are evidence from collaborators at University of South Florida, Donnie Smoke and Josh Breithaupt, suggests that they aren't in most cases able to keep pace, and that it's both an interaction between the organic and inorganic sediment accumulation rates that influence, you need both to keep pace with or above sea level. And so really, honestly, it doesn't look super promising unless you have areas of really high accumulation rates. And so those are not going to be in areas where mangroves are small. They're going to be in areas where mangroves are taller and more productive.
If I might, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna tag on to that and ask, if ocean circulation continues to decrease, do you think that we'll see more natural events such as hurricanes become more rapid, like we've seen in recent years?
That's a great question. I think that the circulation of the ocean and also the circulation of the jet stream and where it, this is not my expertise, but from what I read, like that drives whether or not a hurricane is slow or fast. It drives whether it stalls. And in the case of Sally, it's the reason why it was moving at 2 miles per hour. So yes, I think we will, because as the circulation slows and the temperature increases, it just means that there's more energy to go into cyclonic events. But in terms of the restoration infrastructure, this stuff is meant to stay around. I mean, we shouldn't have had a road through the Everglades. I mean, there's also I-75, Alligator Alley, another big conduit blocking flow, but the goal is to keep it. So it's permanent infrastructure, and it's actually working right now. And it came on within the first bridge was 2011, 2012, and then the ones behind me were finished up in 2018.
So I'll close up with a connecting question about that increased water flows. And I was really intrigued about the results you presented on basically decreasing biomass and density with the increasing flow. And of course, it got me thinking about what's the driver. But then I was confused enough that what is the response variable that you're measuring? And for example, if the area of slough increases and you're characterizing biomass in the slough and it's a naturally lower standing biomass than in the ridge, is that what you're capturing in that declining graph? Really a patch redistribution? Or are you really measuring a density of sawgrass reduction in a ridge patch?
Those are great questions. So we are measuring these in ridges. So we have our long-term plots that are in ridges, but they're ridges that are bordering the slough. It's not like in the center of the ridge. So it is showing that the slough is expanding, and that's, and that is part of the process of ridge and slough typology. And so I think we're just capturing that. It's not necessarily like sawgrass is declining, it's all declining everywhere, but our long-term plots on this fringe of our ridge are showing that restoration is actually causing a decline in sawgrass, which is expanding the slough. We don't look at we do in some sites look at the Iliocoris densities and biomass. And in those locations, those are increasing. So indicating that the slough biomass is, at least that component of the slough biomass is increasing. So yeah, water depth, hydro period, favoring the slough over the ridge, I think is what we're really getting at.
So rather than like a phosphorus depletion mechanism reducing productivity
Yeah.
due to like limiting nutrient.
I don't believe it's phosphorus related directly anyway. Especially at those marsh sites, okay, so in some of the marsh sites that are outside of our long-term plots, we are seeing a change in phosphorus because we're seeing a change in hydro period. But at these particular locations in our LTR sites, the hydro period itself isn't changing as much as the water depth is. And so that phosphorus link is more associated with changing hydro period, we think, and proximity to hot spots of phosphorus, which were closer to the bridge and historic canal phosphorus. Yeah.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for that broad overview of disturbances in the Everglades and scales of, intra-annual to millennial. We really appreciate that scale when we think about wetland systems. Yes, please help me thank Dr. Kominoski, yes, with either a real or a virtual clap here. So thanks very much. Next week, we'll be back with Dr. Vince Loveco from the Moat Marine Lab. He'll be talking about changes in phytoplankton community structure as an indicator of ecosystem disturbance. He may talk to us about red tide, I expect. And for students, just know that you got your assignment one page or less right up of today's seminar, and we will see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good week.
Stop recording. It's always a little weird and abrupt. We just ended and there he goes. Okay, he's gone. Fine. All right. Good to see you, Kathy. You guys holding up okay? Awesome. All right.